Hello all, and welcome to ICC for the final match of the FIDE Grand Prix in Belgrade, Serbia. This is the second out of 3 total legs in the 2022 series. And we started this tournament with 16 players, and we are down to the final 2, Richard Rapport and Dmitry Andreikin. And we're here to look at their final match, which follows the same format as the previous tournament and also in the semi-final match from this tournament. The 2 players play 2 classical games, and then if that is tied 1-1, then they move on to 2 rapid games, followed consequently by 2 blitz games and an Armageddon if that would be needed. So for this match we have 2 players who have been playing very well throughout the entire tournament, so it's tough to say who the favorite would be. I guess you would give the nod to Rapport as he's slightly higher rated, but it really would be anyone's match. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So for game 1 we had Dmitry Andreikin with the white pieces, and he opened with e4, and we saw a Petrov from Rapport, so he did not repeat this Spanish line. If you remember that he played against MVL in the semifinals, he played some very interesting bishop to g4 line and h5 and played very aggressively, but he played more solidly in this game. And Andreikin transposed with knight c3 back into this line, the Scotch 4 knights, I believe is what it's called. And it's known as a very safe and solid way for white to try to get a tiny but enduring edge out of the opening. And he chose this move, bishop to d2. Not the most common move, but it's something that people have been doing a lot recently. The main line historically is to take on d5, but this is a sort of new way of doing things. And one idea that could be revealed here is if black plays a move like rook e8, it appears very natural, but white can show a sort of creative idea here with knight takes d5. A little bit unexpected if you haven't seen it before. The point is, if you take on d2, then we take on f6 with check and then recapture. And if black does this, then we can see this forced line leads to this position where white can claim to have maybe a slight edge based on his better pawn structure. It's still not a big deal, but white would be happy to get this and just try to press for a long time in this sort of slightly better and low risk position. That's exactly what white wants. So instead of that, Rapport played bishop takes c3, which is, I think, the most common move, probably the best. And he just takes the pawn on e4, and that leads to some more forcing lines. All this has been seen before, so I assume both players were quite well aware of it. Bishop takes c6, rook b8. It's equal material. White has an extra tempo. That's basically where his hope lies in this opening. He plays rook b1, forcing more trades. As I said before, this has all been seen, even up to this point. Rook to d8, bringing a rook to the d file with tempo and preventing rook b8 for white because of an obvious reason. There's mate on d1. So bishop comes back to f3, and bishop to f5. I think the most common move is king f8. This has been played in, among other games, the game between Karyakin and Vidit in the most recent Tata Steel tournament, where Karyakin was able to win with white. But here Rapport plays bishop to f5, which should also be fine. So rook to b7. Again, it's all about this extra tempo for white. He has to create something quickly, because otherwise it's rather dry and boring. So he takes c2, he takes c7, bishop to e4, again using this back rank. And the idea is white can take on a7 here if he wants, but then black is arguing that even that rook endgame, a pawn down, should still be well within a drawing margin. So bishop to e2, trying to keep some pieces on the board, and g5, creating luft for black's king. And here I think probably Andreikin missed his only opportunity in the game to really create something, some problems for his opponent. He could have played this move rook takes a7 here. And after rook d2, which I presume is black's idea, then bishop to g4 is an interesting move. The point is, you're provoking the move f5, because after bishop to h5, black no longer can play bishop to g6, which he would have been able to do if f5 had not been provoked. And again, that would still be annoying for white because of the back rank stuff. And black could also play bishop to f5 here, and then h3. Again, black, if he wants, can go into a pawn down rook endgame. It should still be a pretty easy draw, but maybe white can try to create more problems here, although I doubt it. It should still be very easy for black. But what Andreikin chose didn't really promise anything either. He played h3, but after a5, black can save his pawns. The point is rook c5, the double attack is met very easily by rook d5. And after rook a7, which was played, then rook to a8 also, we see this bishop on e4 does a very good job of protecting these squares. So after rook e7, bishop to d5, bishop to f3, we get straight into this rook endgame, where black is not even a pawn down at the moment, and yeah, it should be basically an easy draw. So f6, king g2, now he brings the rook to c5, where it's a lot better placed than on a8. f4, just to bring the king into f3, and the rest of the game is pretty straightforward. Rapport brings his rook around to a3, so we can see he's going to start taking pawns, but Andreikin's king is coming in as well. So these things sort of balance each other out. And a4 is a move basically just to prevent the pawn from being fixed on a2. And now, if white is able to, in a dream world, win the a5 pawn and then advance his a pawn, well, it would still be a draw. But at least he would accomplish something. But he can't take on a5 because of rook to h5, losing the rook. And after king takes f6, threatening mate in 1, by the way, Rapport chases the king away. He threatens to take on f2, but there's always this king returning to f6, so it doesn't really do anything. So the players just repeated like this. It was a game that was pretty even the whole time. Neither side had much of anything. Andreikin played a solid opening, I guess, to try to get some slight edge, but neither player made any mistakes, so draw was fair. And that means we move on to game 2, where Rapport has the white pieces, and if he wins, then he wins the match. So let's see what happens. He opens with pawn to d4, and Andreikin plays this a6 move, which is I think maybe a little more common with the knights included on f3 and f6 here. It's a pretty common idea. Here it's also played, maybe not as much. The idea is pretty basic. If white plays like knight f3, for example, then you can take on c4 and then play b5 to try to hold your extra pawn. So often white trades immediately going into this structure. And a3 by Rapport. Not common at all, and you know, I'm certainly not an expert on this opening. I'm not exactly sure about the nuances here. People normally play either a queen b3 here or a knight f3, some normal move, but a3, I guess Rapport, if I had to really take a guess, he just likes taking his opponent out of theory very early on. I'm not sure if there's some groundbreaking idea behind a3, but he likes to play these unconventional positions because he believes that he can fare very well when neither player is in their opening book. So not a very deep answer to why a3 was played, but that's all I've got. I'm sorry. And h6, this move I can explain a lot more easily. Black does not have to worry about any bishop to g5 pin in the future, and I would say that this move is a lot more useful than white's a3, so it's definitely justified for black. I guess the reasoning is white spent a tempo on a3, so why not spend my own tempo if there's nothing more important to do at the moment. So now both players start developing their pieces. Bishop f4, knight f6, e3, c5. Very direct approach. He's accepting an isolated pawn if white wants to give it to him. But he plays bishop to e5 instead. And this is, again, very concrete. He has ideas potentially to take on f6, thereby forcing either queen takes f6, knight takes d5, or for black to take with the g pawn, which would ruin his pawn structure. So that's why bishop to e6 is played, to lend support to the d5 pawn. Knight e2. Again, a little strange to develop the knight like this instead of to f3, but it's a very specific idea that he put his bishop on e5, he's bringing his knight to f4, he's very clearly playing against this d5 pawn that has been weakened as a result of black's move c7 to c5. So both players continue playing normally, knight c6, knight f4, he takes on d4, and now white doesn't really want to take back with the pawn, because the whole point is he wants to try to attack black's d5 pawn, so he wants to keep the pawn structure like this. He takes with the bishop. Bishop to d6. Note that the d5 pawn is indeed not hanging, because at the end of the line, black has a bishop to b4 discovery winning the queen. So if you just imagine white plays knight f takes d5, and each side continues to take on d5, at the end there's bishop to b4, which is a discovery. So again, this is not surprising. We play g3 to develop the bishop to g2. We can see that the plan is still to do something about this d5 pawn. Rook to c8, rook to d1, and queen to a5. So so now Rapport chooses something interesting. He brings his rook back to c1. So I'm not sure if he's arguing that the queen is worse placed on a5 than on d8. There's also some potential ideas of bishop takes a3 that you have to look out for, undermining the defense of the c3 knight. And then if rook a1, then even bishop takes b2, it could continue. And there would be some tactics to calculate there. So Rapport decides it's worth it to spend a tempo just to safeguard his knight. Black castles, and now we see this trade on e6. So Rapport decides that he has nothing left to gain by pressuring this d5 pawn, and instead he switches the pawn structure in this manner because he wants to have a new target, the e6 pawn. And if the e6 pawn is taken, then the d5 pawn would fall as well. So Andreykin has to defend that, of course, and he plays king f7. And that might look a little surprising. Perhaps rook f to e8 would appear more natural. But the idea here is that the king on f7 is basically safe. And black plans in the future to use his f8 rook for something more important. He's going to double on the c file. As you see with the arrows I've drawn here, he can play rook c4 and bring the other rook to c8. Whereas if he had played his rook to e8 right now to defend his e6 pawn, then his rook would be tied down, and he might need to spend extra time in order to free his defense of the e6 pawn to use both of his rooks. So that's why I think the king on f7 is perfectly fine, and it's a normal move in this position. And we see this happen. He brings his rook to c4, bishop to e5. White doesn't want to let his knight on c3 get taken and mess up his pawns, so he moves his knight out of the way. And the rooks are doubled, as predicted. One pair is traded. And b4. So it's a little bit strategically risky, because this a3 pawn could be a problem, but at the moment it's not really a big deal. It's securely defended. Queen comes to a4, knight f4, pressurizing this e6 pawn yet again, so that must be taken. E takes, because we want to use the e file, of course. Queen c6, and queen to e3. So at this point it is going to get quite concrete very soon, and even though it might not look like it at the moment, soon the evaluation is going to hinge on some very specific details, and each move could potentially be a serious error. So knight e4 is the move that kind of initiates this. So we need to realize here that black sort of is very happy in the long term, because he has complete control of the c file, and if he's allowed to play like rook c3, he can maybe think about taking the a3 pawn. If the queens get traded, that would be fantastic for black. All endgames would be close to maybe much better for him, or even winning depending on the circumstances. So white definitely needs to act right now. And the only drawback of this move knight to e4 is that it walks right into f3, so of course that's what white plays. And the idea is to play rook c3, queen to d4, and he just offered a repetition with rook to c4. So if Rapport had chosen to go back queen e3, then we certainly would have seen a draw, and that would have been the end of things right there. We would have moved on to tie breaks. But nope, after repeating once, he decides to go forward with queen e5. And this is the start of a very forcing line that is pretty difficult to calculate entirely from the beginning. In particular, considering we're on move 30 right now, and the players get extra time on move 40. That means that they're starting to run into time trouble. And basically both players have to calculate best they can and rely on their instincts at critical moments. So knight to d2. At this point, white has to go all in, and he knew this when he played queen e5. He was making a big commitment. You don't have time to play rook f2, just to illustrate, because say rook c1 and knight c4, and black's pieces are very much active here, and the white queen can't run away because of knight e3 mate, so it has to stay close to guarding the king, and then white basically has nothing. If he's not able to use his queen for active purposes, then black will be dominant. So you don't have time to do anything like that. You can't care about this rook. So f5 is the move. Just sacrificing this f1 rook for an attack. So now is an interesting moment where Undraken took on f1 immediately, but queen b6 is worth considering. So now it gets complicated, so bear with me. I'll try my best to explain. So you can't play rook f2 because if knight takes f3 check. That's pretty clear. So you've got to give the rook away. And the difference here is now white has already moved his king away, and we'll see in the future that in some lines there's king takes f1, if you don't include the check on b6. This will become more clear when I compare it to the game continuation. But anyway, here white would take on e6, and king e8 would be losing here because of queen to h5. If king to d8, queen takes d5, and you're either getting mated or you're losing your rook on c4 at the very least. So you have to go here, queen f7, queen d7, we can take this pawn, we can come back. Now f4, forcing the king forward, d4 or e4, let's say d4, and then we can just take on f1, and here we're not mating black, but our e pawn is the big problem, and yeah, it's going to queen soon, and black is not very well coordinated to get any sort of counterplay going. So king e8 would certainly be wrong there, but black can play king g8, and this would be objectively equal. So if e7, looks like black can resign, right? Because we're going to make a queen, but there's knight takes g3. And if we recapture that, then rook c1 check and queen g1 mate is a slight problem for white. So we have to move up, king g2, rook c2, queen g1, and now queen g5, forcing a queen trade. And at the end we lose the e-pawn, and we're just down the exchange. So e7 is not working here, but white can make a draw with queen b8, bishop f5, and now e7. The point is we got our bishop to f5 with tempo, so these lines that we looked at before where we were getting in trouble with our king sort of getting caught, not being able to go to to h3, that's not going to be a problem anymore. And there's a lot of ways for black here to not lose the game. But just to show one of them, a common idea that you'll see here is that white has a very nice desperado sacrifice here, because black is threatening mate in 1 with rook to c1, but we have this move. Pretty nice. And then we make a queen with check, and then queen f8, queen f7 will be a perpetual. Okay, so that was if black threw in this move queen b6 first. And the idea is, in this line, it's safe for black to go king to g8, and then it's a draw, basically. So this didn't happen. Knight takes f1 was played, which is still fine, but it's a little bit trickier. So f takes e6. Now king to g8 would be a completely different story. It would lose in this case, because now e7. You'll remember, in the line I just showed you, the queen was already on b6, and white's king was already on h1. But here, if queen to b6, king f7 is, I guess, best, but if queen to b6, then king takes f1. It's a little bit different now. And rook c1, king e2, there's no checks, and the king just runs away, and it's game over. So, black could play king f7, and then white has maybe a couple ways, but this is simplest. You don't really need to keep calculating after this. You win the rook back, and you're up a pawn, and black's knight is getting trapped maybe, and it's just completely hopeless. So, king to e8 is what was played, and this actually is a losing move. Very surprising. So the only move here to save the game would have been king to e7. Looks a lot less natural than king e8 because you allow this pawn to be taken with check, but the point is you want the d6 square. You've got to escape with your king and get off the back rank. And at this point, if white plays e7, it's quite risky because of queen b6, and if you take the knight, then queen comes to e3, and we see the queen get behind this pawn, so it's not going to be queeny. And also black has deadly threat of rook c1 and rook g1 mate. So this is quite scary. So probably white should play queen f8 just to chase the king away some more. And the point is now that we're threatening queen d8, so black has to be a lot more urgent. But he can still save the game quite straightforwardly by playing this way with rook to e1 check. Sacrificing his rook simply because he needs to get his queen and he needs to start a perpetual check pattern. And here, if the king runs to f1, then queen to d3 check, and if the king runs to d1, then same, and the queen just follows the king, and white has nothing at all to do. It's a draw. So notice that something very similar will happen in the actual game, but here this works out very well for black because white had to throw in this queen to f8 check, which dragged his queen off this diagonal. So you'll see, if that doesn't make sense now, you'll see in a few minutes why that's very important, why black would prefer that white's queen was off this long diagonal. So king to e8, as I said before, is what occurred in the game, and it's a losing move. So queen takes g7. Now we're threatening queen f7 check followed by e7 and e8 queen. So black can, at a few moments from this point on, he can play something like queen c7 just to stop the threat. But the problem with this is that it gives white time to just take his material back, and this is good because now white's not even down material anymore, and his king is safe, and he still has this e-pawn, and black's king is very exposed, and it should be a pretty straightforward win for black, for white rather. So queen c7, while it does not lose immediately, it will certainly lose in the long run, so it's not really a good option. So you should go for this. Queen b6, king takes f1, and he played rook c1 here. King e2. Here queen c7 is possible, and it's a little bit more challenging because now white's king is exposed, and if black has time, then black can play queen c2 or queen c4 and start causing problems. But with 2 accurate moves, white can put a stop to all of that. He plays queen h8. It's better than queen g8 because you want to keep your queen on this long diagonal. And after king e7, there's a very, very nice move here. Maybe you can pause the video if you're interested to try to find it for white. But the only winning move here is bishop to f5, which is maybe not completely obvious from afar because you're sort of putting a stop to your own attack and you're spending a tempo. But once you see the move, you can realize how strong it is, because now you just take away the c2 square as a check, and black is quite unable to drum up any sort of play here. And the bishop can come back to d3 to block queen c4 check, for example. So yeah, once white can take this time out to protect his own king, then he will be able to realize his advantage. But instead, I mean, again, remember both players are kind of short on time, and this is move 35. Andreikin goes for this same idea that we looked at before, but you will recall that I said that there's going to be a difference, that this queen is on g7 and is controlling this long diagonal, rather than on f8 as in the line I showed previously. So black is going all in, just trying to get a perpetual, but a perpetual does not exist here. So the players repeat a little bit to get to time control. He plays king b1 back to c1, and now he's able to take some time and calculate the forced win. So king b2. So the problem for black here is that if white is able to bring his queen back from g7 to block a check at any moment, then it's over, because then the queen will be able to protect the king, and then white is up a piece for nothing. So you have to give checks in a way that does not allow white to bring his queen back. But unfortunately, due to the specific configuration of the pieces, that's not possible. And it's sort of unfortunate because it's very tough to calculate that from far away, and you sort of have to take a guess in a sense. But here white is able to fend off the checks. So after queen to d2, he starts with king a1. And note that here the queen is on d2, and that's very important. Black needs the queen on d2 to play queen to c1 check. And the idea here is that after king a2, if the queen was somewhere else, like say you had to play queen c2 check, right? Then the queen just comes back to b2. This is what I was saying before. If white can accomplish this, that's it. Then the checks will run out very soon. Queen to c4, king a1, no more checks. Game over. So that's why you need this move, queen c4 check. You need to give checks in a way where white cannot bring his queen back. But the winning plan here is to do a triangulation of sorts. So king to b2. Because now queen e2 is the only way, and now king to a1. And you'll notice this is the same position as a few moves previously, if I go back, except now the queen is on e2 instead of like it was here on d2. If we go forward, the queen is now on e2. And the problem is that if queen to d1 check, then king to a2. That's why I said it was very important to play queen to c1, queen to c4, because now there is no check on c4, and there is no way to prevent white from bringing his queen back like this on the following move, which will win the game. So that's the whole point of this maneuver, to drag the queen to e2 and take away this resource from black. And by the way, this is the only way to win for white, so this is something you have to see. In order to properly evaluate this, you have to see it from quite a few moves back, and that's not easy. So Andreikin played sort of a funny move here, queen to f1, because now if king to a2, then queen to c4. But of course, he just lost his queen, and now it's the end of the game. So it's also very interesting that if this bishop wasn't on h3, then this would be a draw for black because queen f1 is available. So it's these little details that are very difficult to see from far away, but they can often decide the results of games. So yeah, Rapport won the game, and he therefore wins the match and the tournament, and that will almost guarantee him a place in the candidates. I don't know the exact percentage, but I think it's very, very high, like north of 95%, because he won his group in the first leg in Berlin, and now he won the tournament overall in this leg. So he has quite a lot of points, and it would take something to go very horribly wrong, because he doesn't play the third leg, he already played the first two. So he would need some really unlucky series of occurrences to happen in the third leg for him to not qualify. So yeah, congrats to him. He played very well, definitely played the best out of anyone in this tournament. And from this point on, all eyes are going to be on the third leg, which will be starting in Berlin very soon. And we're going to have a lot of people vying for these candidate spots. We'll see Hikaru and Levon come back, and a host of other players who will be chasing basically only one spot at this point, since Rapport has almost secured it, but in any event, it's going to be a very, very close race, and I'm very excited to see what happens. So join us next time to look at that, and until then, enjoy your life.